Hello, these are the readings and the commentary for the third Sunday of Easter. This year that would be April 30th, 2017. And the first reading is from chapter 2 of the Acts of the Apostles. Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice and proclaimed, "You who are Jews, indeed all of you staying in Jerusalem, let this be known to you and listen to my words. You who are Israelites, hear these words. Jesus the Nazarene was a man commended to you by God with mighty deeds, wonders, and signs, which God worked through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. This man, delivered up by the set plan and foreknowledge of God, you killed, using lawless men to crucify him. But God raised him up, releasing him from the throes of death, because it was impossible for him to be held by it. For David says of him, 'I saw the Lord ever before me. With him at my right hand, I shall not be disturbed. Therefore my heart has been glad and my tongue has exulted. My flesh too will dwell in hope. Because you will not abandon my soul to the netherworld, nor will you suffer your Holy One to see corruption. You have made known to me the paths of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence.' My brothers, one can confidently say to you about the patriarch David that he died and was buried, and his tomb is in our midst to this day. But since he was a prophet and knew that God had sworn an oath to him that he would set one of his descendants upon his throne, he foresaw and spoke to the resurrection of the Christ, that neither was he abandoned to the netherworld, nor did his flesh see corruption. God raised this Jesus. Of this we are all witnesses. Exalted at the right hand of God, he received the promise of the Holy Spirit from the Father, and poured him forth, as you see and hear." The word of the Lord. The second reading is again from what scholars believe is a baptismal homily, but it was converted into a letter. 1 Peter is that letter, and it's from the very first chapter. "Beloved, if you invoke as Father him who judges impartially according to each one's works, conduct yourselves with reverence during the time of your sojourning, realizing that you were ransomed from your futile conduct, handed on by your ancestors, not with perishable things like silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a spotless, unblemished lamb. He was known before the foundation of the world, but revealed in the final time for you, who through him believe in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God." The word of the Lord. The gospel is that very famous story from the last chapter of Luke, chapter 24, of Jesus encountering two disciples on the road to Emmaus. Now, you have to remember that Jesus told his disciples no one was supposed to leave Jerusalem until after they received the Holy Spirit. And here you have these two people disobeying Jesus and are leaving. It's important when Jesus meets them that he doesn't meet them head on. The Greek verb here means he overtakes them. Jesus is coming out of Jerusalem himself. That very day, the first day of the week, two of Jesus' disciples were going to a village 7 miles from Jerusalem called Emmaus, and they were conversing about all the things that had occurred. It happened that while they were conversing and debating, Jesus himself drew near and walked with them, but their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. He asked, "What are you discussing as you walk along?" They stopped, looking downcast. One of them, named Clopas, said to him in reply, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know of the things that have taken place there in these days?" He replied to them, "What sort of things?" They said to him, "The things that happened to Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word, before God and all the people. How our chief priests and rulers both handed him over to a sentence of death and crucified him. But we were hoping that he would be the one to redeem Israel. And besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since this took place. Some women from our group have astounded us. They were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body. They came back and reported that they had seen a vision of angels who announced that he was alive. Then some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found things just as the women had described, but him they did not see. And he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are! How slow of heart to believe all that the prophets spoke. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them what referred to him in all the scriptures. As they approached the village to which they were going, he gave the impression he was going on further. But they urged him, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening and the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. It happened that while he was with them at table, he took bread, said the blessing, broke it, and gave it to them. With that their eyes were open and they recognized him, but he vanished from their sight. Then they said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he spoke to us on the way and opened the scriptures to us?" So they set out at once and returned to Jerusalem, where they found gathered together the 11 and those with them who were saying, "The Lord has truly been raised and has appeared to Simon." Then the two recounted what had taken place on the way and how he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The Gospel of the Lord. One of the things that we have to realize here is that the early church thought it was very important for the followers of Jesus to have an experience of the risen Jesus. I don't know that we Catholics especially emphasize that very much today. We talk about Jesus being present in the church, so we have a relationship with the institutional church. We talk about Jesus being present in the bread and wine during the Eucharist. But to actually experience the presence of the risen Jesus in other people or in other situations isn't something that Catholics really emphasize very much at all. It's important, as I always stress, to understand the difference between resuscitation and biblical resurrection. Most of us, when we think of Jesus' resurrection, think of it as a resuscitation. When Jesus comes out of the tomb, he's still basically the same person he was when he died at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Good Friday on Golgotha. But that's not what biblical resurrection is. In resuscitation, you come back as the same person, which means the widow of Nain's son, Jairus' daughter, and Lazarus, the three persons who Jesus brought back to life in the Gospels, really were not raised from the dead, technically, from a biblical definition of that term, raised. They simply were resuscitated. They were still the same people they were when they were brought back to life by Jesus as they were before they died. I always joke and say that if Jairus' daughter liked pepperoni pizza before she died, when Jesus in Mark's Gospel tells them to give her something to eat, they would obviously pop a pepperoni pizza into the microwave. She's still the same person. And you know the basic difference between resuscitation and resurrection because those three individuals eventually died again. When you are raised from the dead, you never die again. And you become, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians, a new creation. You simply are not the same individual you were before you died. That's why Paul stresses in Galatians 3 that the risen Jesus isn't a Jew or a Gentile, isn't a slave or free, isn't even male or female. The resurrected Jesus is unique. And the early church basically said, we like to experience that risen Jesus as Paul did when he said, "I saw the Lord," and in the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 9, they narrate the appearance of the risen Jesus to him on the road to Damascus. But the question that's very important is, how do we experience that risen Jesus? The gospel tells us the main way that the first Christians experienced that Jesus, as the two disciples, Clopas and probably Mrs. Clopas, experienced Jesus on that road to Emmaus when they stopped at the inn for the night and ate a meal together. They stress when they get back to Jerusalem that he appeared to us in the breaking of the bread. The early church said, in the Eucharist, in the breaking of the bread, in the Lord's Supper, that is the place par excellence where we experience Jesus. Not necessarily in the bread and wine as we Catholics believe, but we experience Jesus in those around us, those who represent the risen Jesus, who we experience when we gather together with them and give ourselves to them in that Eucharist. If we don't experience him or her there, we're going to have to wait until we die to have an experience of someone that the early church believed you would experience long before death. As I mentioned in the commentary, if we don't experience the risen Jesus in our daily life, we really have wasted a lifetime. But they're not talking about the Mass or our experience of the Mass when in Luke they speak about they recognized him in the breaking of the bread. Please, we're used to just going to church on Sunday or Saturday night and a priest narrates certain words, says certain things, they sing hymns, and we very nicely leave there saying, well, we experienced Jesus alive in the bread and wine. The early church would say, the Eucharist should be a dying to yourself. And how do you basically die? One of the main ways was to really become psychologically one with everybody else there. I sometimes would joke with my parishioners in Reno and say, there's been a few occasions when I looked out of the sacristy before the celebration of the Eucharist and noticed there were 2 Republicans in church. And I still came out and presided at the Eucharist with the Republicans there and tried to become one with them. I'm afraid if we're not dying enough to become one with everybody at the Eucharist, we're going to have, as I said before, to wait until we get to the pearly gates to experience something that the first followers of Jesus experienced every time they gathered for the Lord's Supper. Thank you very much.